Yeah. Okay. Okay, folks, I think we'll make a start. It's just about 5 past according to my clock. Okay, that's a welcome to the 5th of our conversations in the relaunch of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. It's my absolute privilege and a pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. That is Professor Heidi Safi Marza. She's Emeritus Professor of Equality Studies in Education at UCL. In the Institute of Education, is also a visiting professor of race, faith, and culture at Goldsmith College, also in the University of London, and also the LSE. Heidi and I first met about 15 years ago, like we were sort of reminiscent. I think we examined the doctoral thesis together. And I will say that like she played good cop and I played bad cop. And the student did pass with sort of very minimal, I think, studies. And actually, like she sort of sends her regards. So that was Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis. She is now a chaplain and a lecturer at Concordia University in Canada. And so when I sort of said that, like, so when I said that, like, you were our guest speaker tonight, she said, like, to send her best regards and to say that she was very, very grateful, like, for all the helpful suggestions that you made 15 years ago for her doctoral defense. So there you go. So like, you have many fans in the room and a fan also in Canada.
That's nice.
So Heidi, we are in your hands, and hopefully the screen sharing will still work as it did before, and please take it away.
Okay, thank you. There we go. Can you see the screen? For some reason, the where is it? Just it's the slideshow is not clicking. This has happened to me before, and nice. I don't understand why, because I'm in it, but it's just not moving.
It should be on full screen before it goes into slideshow.
Yeah, but the slideshow button should just click. It just did just now when we rehearsed. This is where you might have to take over, Anthony. This is, I don't understand, like my
Okay, so put it into full screen first, I think someone said. So try it in full screen first and see if it makes a difference there.
Oh, this is where I get really flustered with the technology.
Yeah.
Don't know. There we go. I've got it.
Ah, there we go.
Yes. Okay. Yes, we got it. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. It's such a pleasure to be at this relaunch series. I'm going to talk to you about a paper that I've written on Muslim women. But first of all, I want to start by paying tribute to our ancestors. This is something that we often forget to do. And I'm often asked, what does decolonizing mean? Because I'm very much part of the decolonizing higher education and the curriculum globally. And I say that, you know, it's about understanding who we are and the knowledges that are in our communities that we forget about. And I want to pay tribute to my grandmother, who you see here in the black and white picture. She was, at the turn of the 20th century, she was a Bible woman in Trinidad. And she would travel the length and breadth of the island in the very remote jungle areas, teaching the women to read and write with the Bible. And I often feel that, you know, my grandfather, who then was converted by the missionaries and became a Presbyterian minister, the first local person to be a minister in the Caribbean, he got all the credit and she was forgotten. So I want to pay tribute to these brave women, the transformative agents that go unsung in history. And also, you know, as an introduction to my paper on Muslim women, you know, the Muslim women, their resilience in the face of the constant barrages of negativity that we get from the government, with Boris calling women letterboxes, and, you know, the actual Islamophobia that is rampant and is part of the general discourse, the allowable discourse. What you're allowed to say says something about how people are perceived. So I want to talk about the context of this paper. So it's interesting that I'm talking about Muslim women, but I'm also using a Black feminist framework. Some people might think that that is not you know, it doesn't mesh, you know, but for me, it's something that I have been working on for 40 years. And I love this quote by Gayatri Spivak, one of the post-colonial scholars, tremendous scholars from the United States. And she says, it's the work of the Black and post-colonial feminist she says, to simply ask the simple question, what does this mean? And begin to plot a history. So I want to ask today, what does it mean when we hear the this negativity that I've been talking about from very top levels? Since 9/11, there has been a widespread Islamophobia and deep emotions that stir up deep emotions of hate and fear and horror and pity and disgust for Muslim women. And we call this kind of this affect, this feelings that people have towards different ethnic groups, racialized groups, the affect that kind of conjures up emotions, deep emotions. Muslim women have become these unwanted people in the midst, particularly in Western countries. So, well, even in their own countries, there is, you know, levels of sexism that we'll be discussing as well. But Audre Lorde, the Black feminist, you know, famous poet and writer who passed away in the 80s, she said, you know, you have to think what happens to Black and othered bodies that are encountered as an object of hate. And she talks about her own experience of being a woman, a little girl on the tube train in New York. They call it not the tube, they call it not the underground, they call it something else. And she said that this woman, a white woman, was sitting opposite, and she was sitting with her mum holding the hand of her mum. And this woman looked upon her and spat and said the most dreadful things, racist things, felt she had a right to do that. And that started her journey into self-discovery and her writing. So it's very much like that with Muslim women. You know, the Muslim female body is encountered as an object of hate in our societies, sanctioned from the very top. And how does that Muslim female body become reformed through that encounter? How does she then construct and reconstruct her identity and who she is in the face of that kind of experience? And this is a way that we work towards dismantling what racism and sexism is. So this talk is looking at how race and gender and religion come together and intersect, and is written on and within the Muslim female body. So it is going deep into the notion of intersectionality, not using intersectionality as simply a buzzword. And the Muslim female body has become a battlefield for competing interests. There's been the hysteria against the niqab, for example, seen as Jack Straw in 2006, started off very open hostility. They seem to be standing outside of the norm. She's also seen again, with this competing interest, as a romantic heroine. She symbolizes being saved from the barbaric other, their husbands and their cultures, and she fights against it. So she is also constructed in this romantic heroine way, against arranged marriages and FGM and all of these atrocities. We hear of these atrocities all the time, magnified. This is not to say that they are not there, they are deeply there, but it is the construction that I'm concerned with today. So we have the hysteria, the construction of romantic heroine, and then we have her as the victim of patriarchal practices, of the barbaric other, symbolic of what is barbaric. The Muslim other, the Islamic world is inherently barbaric in this construction, and she is seen as a woman at risk. I do remember when I was working with the Blair government in the 1990s, Sherry Blair and the president's wife, Bush, I think Bush's wife, they went over and they were, of course we need schools for girls and things like this, but they went over to engage in a sensational media festival of saving young Muslim girls from the Taliban. Again, you have to ask why are certain groups picked at certain times? So these are the questions that Gayatri Spivak is asking us to think about. What does it mean when we read a story about the young Muslim girls that went to Syria, for example? What are we reading? What is that story about, rather than the media story? Look behind it and see behind the veil. Sarah Ahmed says, and she's a very well-known philosopher in Britain, often not given her credit because she's female and of Muslim origin. So, but Sarah Ahmed talks about the gift, and the gift, she says, you can be different in a multicultural society, but never too different. You must never object the host's embrace. So if you're given a drink of alcohol, if you reject that drink of alcohol, you are rejecting the host, you're rejecting their hospitality. If you're given pork and you don't want that, you are rejecting the hospitality of the host. So she said you can be different, but never too different. So the story that I want to ask today is, what happens when Muslim women, senior women, professional women, go into universities and are different? They dress different, they might have different priorities, they might have different accents. How does racism play out, and sexism and religious discrimination play out in their lives? So I use a theory called, that I've been working on again for many years, of embodied intersectionality. So embodied intersectionality is what I was saying earlier about how race, class, and gender come together and intersect. Now we use intersectionality, as we do with decolonizing, very much as buzzwords, but actually it's very much about identity and how race, class, and gender and religion are lived through their subjectivity, how they see themselves. Do they see themselves in some kind of untouched way, or does the outside world come in to their identities? So secondly, we have to ask about their lived experience, therefore. How does her embodied experience play out through the struggles that she experiences, particularly in the materiality of her circumstances? And what I mean by that is, like, for example, violence against women, or women in sweatshops that make our clothes, and what is the materiality of their conditions because of the construction of their identity by the wider society, and there also by herself. How much choice does she have in her material circumstances, what she can do, what she can't do, and how that therefore is structured in her life. So the final point here is structural sedimentation. So how does her difference become organized into systematic social relations? So it isn't just how you might think about me as a professor in your department, for example, but how is that negativity and maybe sometimes positivity about how people feel and construct her and see her, how does that become organized into what we might call institutional discrimination, systemic social relations, into our institutions, into our political and economic structures? And how does that play out in different historical moments? So the particular historical moment that we're talking about is very Islamophobic in the West at the moment. I mean, the Islamophobia has always been there in different constructions through time, but the virulence since 9/11 has played out particularly for them. So we've got identity linked to how that becomes structural, and therefore where some of the solutions lie. So I just want to do something that I do with my students, not to say that I'm teaching you anything that you might not already know, but as I said earlier, you know, intersectionality is often seen as a buzzword, and people go like, oh, we're going to do a report on race, class, gender, and everything like this, you know, from very government levels, they often do that. And actually, they're not doing intersectionality. They might talk about disabled people in one section, and then women in another section, and faith-based groups in another section, all in the same report, but it's not doing intersectionality. Intersectionality is based on, well, Black women's theorizing. Angela Davis wrote a book called Race, Class, and Race and Class in the 1980s, early 1980s. And Kimberly Crenshaw refined those ideas. She's also another Black woman, legal theorist in the 1990s. And she talked about seeing intersectionality as a traffic light metaphor. I often think it's more like the Arc de Triomphe, you know where all the roads meet in the middle, and where the star is, that is, if you imagine, that is the Muslim woman, that is her personality, her makeup, the way what she's wearing, her life circumstances, the job she's doing, she's there. That is her identity, that is who she is. And it's impacted by these avenues of oppression, you know, like roads of structural racism, religious discrimination, or faith-based restrictions. On the side, I'm not very good with this drawing, so I put on the side, you know, you could have patriarchy, post-coloniality, where she came from, migration patterns, her sexuality, her ethnicity. She could be, you know, a Somali Muslim woman, or instead of a Pakistani Muslim woman. She could be young or old, disabled. She could be pregnant. All these things impact her class, her, you know, the fact that she's a woman. All these things impact on her, create her subjectivity and identity, but similar also, she's in the wider society, which sees her in a particular way. So unlike, let's say, the archetypal white male, who might have different choices, she has less choices, or particular choices about what she can do and what she can become, and where she is allowed to be in different institutions. So I want to talk to you about the actual study that I've done. The wrong way. I did a study a few years ago, it was about 2014, for one of the biggest surveys on race and ethnicity. It's called Understanding Society. It is actually a bit like a labor force survey, and it has, Understanding Society had over 100,000 people and 40,000 households. And for the ethnicity strand, we had to do questionnaires on belonging and identity. So we interviewed 14 sorry, more than 14, about 20 women, and they Muslim women, amongst others. And the data was so fascinating around, they were professionals as well in this particular cohort, but it was fascinating how they saw themselves and their experiences in higher education in particular. So I said before that post-coloniality, and I know, Anthony, this is one of your areas of interest. Areas of post-coloniality are kind of shape our migration process of how we've come, you know, to Britain or to Canada or whatever country that Muslims are seen as migrants. And I love this quote by Lata Mani. Lata Mani is again, a post-colonial feminist theorist, and she says, being a woman of color in the West, she says, the disjunctures between how I saw myself and the kind of knowledge about me that I kept bumping into the West opens up new questions for social and political inquiry. I love that quote, because she says how she sees herself and how the West sees herself makes her ask questions, you know, about social and political theory and inquiry. This is going back to Gayatri Spivak's question, you know, we've got to keep asking questions and answering back to the dominant ideas. And so what Frantz Fanon says is that our bodies are sealed into the crushing objecthood of the skin. And that as well is a very important and interesting analogy to seeing the veil as a second skin. It's the way in which no matter what you can do, the epidermalization of your skin, you cannot rub it off. And for the Muslim women, wearing the veil, for example, is something that is non-negotiable to them, though we see in France and other places the attack on women, and here in Britain too, who do wear the veil. So there is this kind of sense in which this crushing objecthood of the veil shapes this woman's life. So she says, one of the women, Meronissa, in the interviews tells us, you can see your skin and visible characteristics, for instance, the dressing, the physical appearance. So when I go for an interview, they will look at me as a nation. I will be going for that interview and they will say, hey, this girl is a nation. So that character, physical appearance, my skin will affect others. Discrimination always comes from the other side. So here she says something so profound, actually, about racism. She goes on to call it a kind of gauze. You're always experiencing life through this like a curtain, a gauze, and you're always being judged. But she says discrimination comes from the other side, not from within you. So I know that I'm being asked to do a lot of talks on unconscious bias since Black Lives Matter, and there's a lot of policies to help us as migrants or as Muslims or as Black others to step us up and provide opportunities. But at the same time, if discrimination is coming from the other side, that's where the change has to come, not from within us. So that is an interesting observation. But I love the way she says that this girl is reduced to a nation. No matter what she does, no matter what she's achieved, she is from the Pakistani or Indian nation. She's always from that. That's how she's seen. In fact, she will probably be asked at that interview, where do you come from? Even if she's lived in Britain most of her life. So on to the next one. So looking at more experiences and trying to understand the positionality and the intersectionality of Muslim women's lives. Being in Diaspora Spaces is something that Aftab Bra, another post-colonial Black woman author, has written about. And she talks about sites in which the individual and collective memories and practices collide. This is what a diasporic space is. They reassemble and reconfigure. They are sites of negotiation and contestation over representation and other practices. So the diasporic space is a very creative, very dynamic space. If you think of the Jewish diaspora, if you think of, the Muslim diaspora, Christian diasporas, they are always collective, individual memories reconfigured. And Stuart Hall, one of our Black theorists, talks about the transformation and displacement and condensation that happens, and uses those words, I love them, transformation, displacement, condensation, that happens in different historical moments. And here, this academic researcher, Fatma, she's Turkish and Dutch, and she talks about Islam as her second skin. So she says, and this is her quote, "Being religious or a Muslim is very important to me. It shapes and gives me the power for me. And when I feel weak, I normally do not feel weak. Well, I'm not a weak person, but many times I could feel weak. Then religion is important to me." There's so much ambivalence there, I'm sure you will agree. Having this religious feeling and this religious belief gives you the look to see the life. I mean, the very thin line through life. You connect with things and each other, and you make sense of everything. And that's why religion is so important to me. Here she says, religion is the thin line through the life, and it connects her to everything. It's non-negotiable, as I was saying before, and that it gives her strength. You could see ambivalence and the struggle, but she says that gives her the strength in her job, in her work, and living in Britain, because this was a study looking at Britain. And what the second skin, the religious space does, it's very much a retreat. It gives her the possibility of a retreat into inner space of safety and regeneration. She can grow in that space in a racist world. It protects her, even though in the racism is Islamophobic, but it's still, the irony is that it is her Islamic faith that allows her to survive that very thing that discriminates against her. Halima Begum, one of another social theorist, she talks about the veil being a transcendental space of exclusion, being able to exclude the outside world. And she talks particularly about Bangla Town, which is in Tower Hamlets, and it's quite a very working class, masculine area. And she says the women don't actually feel safe on the streets in their own communities because of that masculinity and that patriarchy and the kind of nationalistic sentiment in their own community, and the veil and the religion offer them a sense of safety from their own menfolk and from the wider society. And then the wonderful Saba Mahmood, who actually passed away fairly recently, in her famous book, she talks about the women's piety and acts of spirituality give them rewards in and of itself. They are not being religious because of the West. They are doing it because these acts of spirituality are the reward. The taqwa is the reward in and of itself, that strong belief. And she says that, this moves Islam beyond the West's understanding of women's liberation. And I've been doing a lot of research in girls' schools where the teachers are trying to save these Muslim girls from their communities, and not some of them are in danger, some of them aren't, but it's because the women, the teachers, have that need to feel that they are empowered to judge and to act on these women's behalf. So there's that sense in saving them and moving towards sort of a Western notion of feminism and so on. So that is again another area of tension in thinking about women's identity. And then in the final quote that I have for you here, Amina Mama, another Black feminist, talks about Black women not simply accepting the images that they see of themselves, but over time use collective histories within oppressive societies to counteract racism and sexism. So this is the speaking back, this is the resilience. And what we found was that these women were, I might call them code switchers, chameleons. They were able to change in order to accommodate the racism and the view that people had of them in order for them to progress in their careers in the university. So it's this, that you have to give up part of yourself sometimes, not sometimes, often, in order to speak the Queen's English or not to offend, not to seem too different. And so this young woman, again, Fatima, she says she speaks 3 languages fluently. And she says, well, English is the language where I express my universal identity. I mean, with English, how can you say? It shapes my universal identity. I speak with English. I can express my identity. I share thoughts, ideas with this language. So here she is. She's actually got this cultural competence. She's culturally competent. It's really interesting with COVID how often, we're talking about, I'm doing working with the Institute of Fiscal Studies on a report, the Deaton Review, and we're looking at COVID around inequalities in society in general, but for ethnic minorities in particular. And, there's this concern about cultural competence, but not quite understanding that actually the diasporic or the migrant is actually very competent in negotiating the world around them. And Amina, who's Canadian Pakistani, and Indian and Bangladeshi, she says that my social identity is basically bound up in an idea of being worldly and nomadic. And that's what I take from being me, what it means to be Canadian, what it means to be South Asian, whatever. They're quite different and they're interesting in their own ways. If I could get passports, have all the passports and go traveling everywhere. I love that because, nowadays it's with Brexit, we've gone back to the blue passport and we're probably going to get passports for vaccines. So it have a whole new meaning. But she's actually talking about being nomadic. And what the women talked about was always about how important food was, going to the mosque, this collective knowing. Their hybridity came from being rooted in their communities and in their memories. Again, the Black feminist Bell Hooks, who writes a lot on education, she talks about what happens when you cross over to the other side of the tracks. She says when she went to college, she had to actually literally cross over the railway track to the other side of the town. She said you lose a piece of yourself and you can't ever go back. But these women, they talked about rooted with their ancestors. They talked about the memories and the psychic landscapes from where they came and the longing for home. The Turkish woman, Fatma, she talks about being able to smell and taste the grass, the smell of the grass in the mountains in Turkey and the taste of the goat's cheese. And she's really evocative about that as her childhood memory and that she keeps that in her heart. So they're not rooted in, these women weren't rooted in this authentic Muslimness that they're seen and perceived as. They're not bunkered down in it. They are able to move in both worlds. So I want to think about, just the final slide is on this embodied intersectionality and looking at the collision of discourses, or what I've called the collision of discourses. Because as before with embodied intersectionality, I was saying that race, gender, class, religion comes together and forms identity. But here with embodied intersectionality, and looking at the wider discourses, I've grouped them actually. So the discourses that shape their identity is very much this move towards multiculturalism, and the idea of tolerance, tolerating. In order for you to become part of the British or the Canadian national society, you've got to be tolerated. And in fact, the language of multiculturalism is about that assimilation and tolerance, and not to reject that gift. And that's, if you like, it put in opposition to Islamophobia. And Islamophobia, as opposed to multiculturalism, is about fear and rejection, about difference, so different that it cannot be tolerated. So you have that tension. And you also have around Islamophobia, fear and risk, that duality of terror and the need for security that actually underpins everything, being tested, when you go through the not taking water on aeroplanes, that risk and the fear of the other. It's imbued in our society. It's also that legitimation that I was talking about early. It's legitimate to hate Muslims. It's being sanctioned from the very top. We call that elite racism in the book that I've written with on that. Elite racism is when utterances come from the very top that allow hate and terror. So also, this is set against securitization. And then the next duality is traditionalism and globalization. The women are caught in this discourse as well, of class and the idea of migration and border crossing from traditional societies into the global world, how class and that movement, like I was saying about shape shifting and moving between two worlds, is a huge underpinning force in our society. And also the East-West, colonialism and modernity. These are the big discourses of our time. And the East and West, the idea of Orientalism and Occidentalism, the idea of two worlds. Public and private, honor and shame, and patriarchy and religion, I've grouped together because this is about the experiences of gender, the public and private, that the family somehow is the place where it should not, particularly in religious communities, not just in Islam, the family is a sanctity. It's the place where, there's patriarchy and privacy, and the state can't interfere. The ability to work within those conditions. Then there are values of honor and shame. You can call it guilt, or whatever, the morality and purity that constrain so women. You bring shame upon your communities. You've got to honor your the patriarchal wishes, arranged marriages, and so on. So these are, and religion is fundamentally linked to patriarchy and culture and ethnicity. It has different variations depending on culture and ethnicity. So these are the kind of discourses that are the huge swilling around, and these impact on their lives. And just to end, just one more, just a quote from Chanda Mohanty. She wrote a wonderful paper called Under Western Eyes in 1988, which is quite a long time ago. And she talks about the latent ethnocentrism of the West, how Muslim women are presented as voiceless, stereotyped, racialized victims rather than active agents working to determine and engage their rights as individuals. I think that that is really a strong quote to end on. And the idea of how do we move, the question I guess I want to leave you was, is it possible for us to escape our bodies as white men, as Muslim women? Is it possible to move beyond that? How can we address things like unconscious bias if we don't ask these questions? And then also, how does anti-Islamic hostility play out in the female body in post-colonial Britain and in Canada and in the Western world? So I leave you with those thoughts for the discussion. Thank you very much. Oh, I'll be back.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Thank you for that. So if we can sort of get rid. Okay, so we've got a full screen.
Oh yeah, let me stop sharing. I'll empty it out.